Friends, my name is Deacon Eunice Attwood, and I'm the Church at the Margins officer with the Evangelism and Growth team for the Methodist Church. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this evening. And with me, my co-host is Paul Morrison. Paul is the policy advisor with the JPIT team, and he and I meet regularly to talk about issues around poverty and people experiencing poverty. And particularly, we're both really concerned about what we're seeing in the inequalities that the pandemic has absolutely exacerbated and that were already pre-existing. And I am really, really bothered and concerned at the way in which the COVID pandemic has only highlighted the pandemic of poverty and the pandemic of racism that was already present in the UK. So this evening, we're going to explore the core question of how can the church respond, how can we listen to, how can we amplify, and how can we be changed by people experiencing poverty. But without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Paul to share with us some of his thinking and some of the questions and issues that he knows this raises for him. Paul, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Eunice, and thank you for giving up a Tuesday night. It's Tuesday, isn't it? Yes. Oh, good. I'm on the right week at least. Thank you for giving up time on a Tuesday night to talk about this. I suppose one of the things that I think is most important is to recognize what was happening just before the pandemic hit, because in terms of poverty and in terms of the numbers in poverty, it was changing, and it was changing quite dramatically even before the pandemic. And I'll throw lots of numbers at you, and I'll show you some graphs in a minute. But I think if you don't remember anything else, in 2010, destitution rates in the UK, and there's a definition of destitution used by Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Destitution rates were around about 150,000, and they tended to be the homeless, people with very long-term problems, and immigrants, and without recourse to public funds, often in quite illegal situations. In 2019, that number had gone to 2.5 million, the majority of whom were British born, the majority of whom had recourse to public funds, so could get benefits, but either weren't for all sorts of various reasons, or they were getting benefits, but that wasn't enough to prevent destitution. So in the 10 years running up to the pandemic, things had gone awfully awry for those at the very bottom of society and in economic terms. And then a pandemic hits. And that pandemic hits those who experience poverty the hardest in a big way. So I'll share my screen. So pre-pandemic, in the United Kingdom, around about between 1/5 and 1/4 of all the people in the United Kingdom were experiencing poverty. That's about 14.4 million. And the measure we're using here, and you may be aware that there was all sorts of fights about what poverty was and what the definitions of poverty are. The measure we're using here is done by the Social Metrics Commission. The person who chaired that commission was Ian Duncan Smith's special advisor. It has been accepted across the right and the left of politics. I don't think it's the best measure of poverty, but it is the one that everyone agrees on. And rather than having fights about getting a perfect measure, it's much better to say that when it goes up, we should be concerned, and when it goes down, we should be happy. And so we will stick with using those numbers. And I think most of the Methodist Church publications will use the Social Metrics Commission stuff from here on in. The thing is that it doesn't really matter how you measure poverty. It went up drastically during the last decade, and it's about 14.4 million. About 4.5 million children in the UK experienced poverty the year before the pandemic. And it's one of the phenomenons of poverty that has changed over the past 25 years is that poverty has increasingly been focused on the young. Here's a graph, and you can see my pointer wiggling. Yeah. So this is age of the person at the bottom and probability of being in poverty along the side. And it's straightforwardly a line that says the younger you are, the more likely you are to experience poverty. And that, it used to be that you hit about 55 and it started to go up. But since that trend changed about 15 years ago, and it's really clear now that poverty has been focused in the young, and it's been focused in young adults as well as children. And it seems to be what's called a cohort effect, which means that it's shifting along, which means that the people who were in poverty in their 20s, it's not that they're gradually falling out of poverty. It's as time moves on, this graph will move across. And so poverty will increase in that way. That's that's the trajectory we're on at the moment. And one of the reasons I sort of mentioned the rates of poverty amongst the elderly is that they used to be the most likely to experience poverty. In 1991, 39% of people aged 65 or over experienced poverty. But we decided it was wrong, and we decided to do something about it. And it took about 15 years to turn it round, but policy was able to turn it round. And to me, that's a story of hope, that when we decide that poverty is wrong, and when we decide we want to change it, it is possible to do it. The phrase, the poor will always be with you, doesn't mean this level of poverty will always be with us. It can change, and it is a choice to decide to change it or to decide not to change it. One of the other things that has changed a great deal about poverty in the UK is that it has moved from being a phenomenon of the elderly and the people who aren't able to work to being a phenomenon of people who are in work. So the majority of these 4.6 million children who experience poverty, the majority of them are in working families. So it's about 3.2 million of that 4.6 are in working families. Not only that, about half of that are in working families where both adults work. So they are in couple families with two people working, often full time, and yet they're experiencing poverty. In the 1990s, that wasn't really heard of. But today it's quite common. And one of the biggest factors in that is the fact that rents and mortgages have got so high that one earner's income is to pay for the accommodation and the other earner's income is to pay for living expenses. And if both earners are in low income, then the maths just don't work. And I think there is a narrative which says that poverty is about being out of work, or if you work hard and do the right thing, you will not experience poverty. That is quite a political statement. It's simply not true anymore. You are much more likely, if you see somebody in poverty, they're more likely to be in work than not. And I wanted to talk about what happened during COVID. And I didn't quite know how to do that because there are no numbers at the moment. All the numbers are up in the air, and the sort of national statistics are up in the air around which are comparable to the numbers I've shown before. So the best we've got is there are a wide range of survey data about how things have affected different types of family. And these graphs are actually about people who are behind in household bills. But I can show you 20 or 30 different graphs, and I can compare a group who were likely to experience poverty before pandemic and against a group who weren't. And you would see that those who were likely to experience poverty before the pandemic were hit hardest. So here we have, if you were white, it's about 12% are behind in one and more household bills in sort of late summer last year. And that actually didn't change very much from what is normal, even pre-pandemic. If you're Black and minority ethnic communities, that goes up to about 18%. But the huge jump was among Black communities, and especially Black urban communities in London especially. That there's a huge jump in people behind on their bills, and that's to do with high rental prices and to do with the sorts of jobs that people on low income often do. Again, I talked a lot about poverty being young rather than old. And again, if you're over 35, it hasn't shifted being behind on a bill. Debt levels haven't shifted amongst even low income communities. For the over 35s, for the under 35s, they've gone up markedly. And when the lockdown started, and I'll stop sharing now. And during the lockdown, I'm sure you'll all have seen it in your own communities, that for the first few months, there was real fear about what was going to happen next. There was real fear about whether or not the food bank was going to be able to reach everyone, when over 65s had to isolate so that lots of volunteers went away, whether or not there'd be enough people to come in and do the things that needed to be done. And there was that fear of the immediate. But what comes really quickly was a realization that the problems caused by the pandemic were focused on the ones who were already struggling before the pandemic. And that's because if you were on short-time work or if you were in a 0 hours contract, you were the first to lose your job. If you had children at home, that was an extra expense. You had lots of added income, lots of added expenses at the same time as income drops. And although universal credit went up by about £20 a week, and for the first month, I thought that was fantastic, and I thought that would make a big dent in the problem. It became clear that £20 a week wasn't close enough, that £20 a week just didn't cover the extra expenses of having kids at home. It didn't cover the extra expenses of just having to stay in your house. I'll finish sort of with a story, which was I was asking someone about the £20 a week and whether or not that was helping them. And what they told me was that to make her budget work each week, she went to 4 different shops in order to get the cheapest food in each place in order to make her budget work. And one day a week, she cooked for her neighbors' kids, and another day of the week, her neighbors cooked for her kids. And that way, they could get enough money together so that their incomes would feed everyone. And all of that stopped. You could only go to one shop. It was probably quite an expensive one. You couldn't share food with your neighbors in the same way. You couldn't do all those things. So all of these strategies that people had worked hard to put in place to make meager budgets go, they all collapsed, and £20 a week didn't cover it. And the reason that story stays in my mind is because when I talk to many people in think tanks and when I talk to people, politicians, there's this view that the poor are in some way faveless, that the reason they don't have enough, the reason they're poor is they can't use their money well. And you heard that story and you realized just how well money was being used, just how efficiently it was being used. And that's why when circumstances changed, it was really fragile, because they had to make every penny count. And when And when they couldn't use those strategies, things started to collapse and fall apart. So I've got half a minute left. The conversation I would love to hear from the people who are here is around how there's this idea that we could solve poverty by maybe changing a benefit system. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who I love, talk about solving poverty. And I don't like that term, because poverty, if we are to reduce poverty, we have to work together. It is not going to go away one day and we can forget about it. The reason why our benefit system leaves some, because the experiences of people like you in the room aren't heard. So it's how we can get those experiences and those ideas moving up and down between policymakers to people who run communities, to people who run churches, to people who experience poverty, and back again. How we can develop, how the church can be part of getting those ideas moving back and forward. And that way we might be able to erode poverty. And for the first time in my life, I've stayed within time, Eunice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And I love the challenge that you've also offered us to think about what is it that we can do? How can we work together? And that's so helpful. So friends, what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to 3 people who are practitioners and who are working alongside people experiencing poverty. And first of all, I'm really delighted to have Leanne here. Leanne, it's such a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about walking alongside people in poverty as they affect policy change. So I want to share my screen, and I'd like to start by sharing with you a picture. And it's a beautiful gift that a group of women gave to councillors in Hull as a memento when they successfully took the council to court. And I'm going to just actually let them tell you the story of what happened.
Hi, I'm Susie Winter. I'm part of a collaborative group called An Untold Story /Voices, where a small group of like-minded, strong women who have had experience or been involved in street prostitution. And An Untold Story Voices is a sort of follow-up group from a book we wrote, a book we collaborated with myself and another 11 women. We challenge people's opinions on street sex work. We wish to challenge authority on their approach to working with working girls on the street. And so far, this year, we've been quite successful actually in abolishing the section 222, which was a legal thing put in place to make these women into criminals, not victims, which is what they are really.
Hi, my name's Amanda Hales, and I'm part of a group from Hull called An Untold Story Voices. In 2014, Hull City Council decided to clean up the streets. They didn't want working girls in the red light district. They described it as a prostitute-free zone. They did this by giving girls banning orders, and they could take them to court and they were fined or put in prison for a couple of weeks. We didn't think that was fair. We thought, well, to tell you the truth, we got really angry about it. We had meetings with Hull City Council, we had meetings with the police, and they just thought of us as an annoying little group making a lot of noise. So we continued and we continued to fight until in 2020, we decided that enough was enough. So many women had been given these banning orders, and their lives are hard enough as it is without getting a banning order from the area sometimes of where they live. I once got shown a banning order by one of the women, and it had the outside marked. And then she pointed to the middle and said, "But I live there." So she was literally banned from her own home. So 2020, we decided to take Hull City Council to court, and that's what we did. And we wanted to work with Hull City Council and the police, but they left us no other option. And the only option was court. So in 2020, in July, they finally withdrew the section 222. They had signposts down in the red light district saying that prostitution is illegal when it isn't. Their aim was to punish the women. And I think that life punishes them enough without being targeted, persecuted and prosecuted by Hull City Council. These banning orders were given out by the police. It might have been a civil court they went to, but they needed a barrister. They was up in front of a judge. They faced fines and they faced imprisonment. To me, this isn't civil, this is the law. It went against all national guidelines with working girls and vulnerable women. It literally stomped all over those guidelines and disregarded them. There was only 7 people who complained about street prostitution, yet this was brought into effect and it affected 70, 80 women. Hull City Council was literally in the paper every other week, patting themselves on the back for the number of section 222s that they've been handed out to numerous women each month. They shouldn't have been patting themselves on the back. We asked them to look at different approaches and they ignored us. We asked them to look at it again, they ignored us. So to have to take them to court was really scary. I wasn't fighting for myself. I'm not at risk of getting a section 222. I escaped. But it just wasn't fair to the women working the streets today. And that's why we fought so hard.
The group that Susie mentioned, Untold Story Voices, emerged from this book, a writing project. And in the book, 12 women, all of whom had been involved in street prostitution in Hull, tell the stories of their lives, and they use poetry and interviews and prose and artwork. It's a book that tells the story of abuse, pain, loss, but also exceptional courage and hope. And I've had the dubious privilege, really, of taking the funerals now of 5 of those 12 women. And it just shows you the reality, really, of lives cut short due to the comorbidities that so often are a consequence of living in poverty. But I have also got the immense privilege of being part of this sewing collective where some of us, the rest of us, still meet and meet with other people. And it's the space where the book was written. And it's also a space where I've learned a lot. So the book and the campaign have been the fruit of a painful and difficult journey by these brave women, voicing and facing their trauma and revealing previously untold stories. Stories that have been untold because to those of us with privilege, those of us who don't need to look in the face the realities that they live with. But not only that, they're stories that have challenged power. The group took incredible risks when they took on the council of the place where they live, the council that collect their bins, the council who know where they live. Speaking up to and challenging not only the council, but also other agencies and charities who couldn't imagine things changing. Now, my own story is that my life's always been fairly protected and comfortable, but I've always had an immense and uncomfortable compassion And since my teenage years, I would describe my hunger for people to experience hope and meaning and love as a hunger for God. And this is what has taken me to the places where I heard God could be found. I've wrestled for most of my adult years with a call to what might get called incarnational ministry, while still living a really privileged life. And I'm still learning, and I'm still interested in sharing my life with other people who are still learning about how we can live like Jesus did, in a way that honours people's stories without telling them what the story should be, without using their stories or manipulating them or placing our own meaning on them. And this is me pictured at a photography exhibition where the women created and exhibited images with the help of Henry Bragg. And the exhibition was called Absence of Evidence. And I was part of the silent exhibition in the city centre last year. There's more information about the exhibition on the video clip that I can share if people are interested. It was really a chance to stand alongside my friends as a memorial to the women who've lost their lives, to show that they're not forgotten. And the images in the exhibition were of a street alley, a patch of wasteland, an industrial estate, all places photographed by the group that look ordinary, but places where serious violent crime against local women have taken place. Unheard stories that form part of the story of the city. So how did I become friends with women whose experience of life is so vastly different to my own? Well, wanting to find God, I went to where I'd heard his spirit could be found and volunteered with Lighthouse, which is a charity in Hull that works with sex workers. And my friend Anna and I found we were meeting some of the same women, and we were both incredibly burdened by how their lives were full of people who wanted something from them, or professionals who intimated they knew how best to live their lives. And it seemed that there was a limited experience of genuine friendship. So we started meeting up with one or two of the women to do some sewing, because it turned out one of the women wanted some curtains. So we decided to make them together. And very simply, one thing led to another. And over 6 years now, organically and slowly, walking the streets in the evenings, meeting people, going to community cafes and spaces during the day, liaising with the local schools about parents that they're concerned about. And we have AUTS, which has become a network of women who are supportive and generous and who share one another's lives, who before COVID would eat together once a week, take on community projects, laugh, cry, share our stories. So AUTS is a group of women from all walks of life, from different cultures, socioeconomic status, different life experiences. And to be honest, it genuinely feels like a little bit of heaven. So I've lost my little cursor to try and...
Don't worry, Leanne, don't worry.
So yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me share.
Leanne, thank you so much for that. Leanne, could I just pause with you there and ask a question? So I really hear how your experience has changed you and how you've listened and you've engaged, and that what if you were going to say something to the church, what would that be? How do you think your experience of being changed? What's the learning for the wider church in that?
And for me, the most important thing is about friendship and genuinely getting to know people rather than assuming that we've got answers and can make a big difference. I think sometimes people know the answers and need the encouragement and the resources to make those changes themselves, because sometimes when we come in and make changes for people, that's just compounding some of the inequalities that they experience all the time.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And thank you for the heart-wrenching and beautiful testimonies of the women and the journey you have been on. Because as you shared there, losing 5 of them and burying them, that is heart-wrenching work to be involved in. So thank you so much. And for the minute, we're going to go now over to Jacqueline. So let's just find Jacqueline.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Leanne, for that. That was lovely. And also Paul for the graphs that you've given to me. I don't think I have much to say, but it was a former Archbishop of Canterbury by the name of William Temple over a century ago who said this, and I quote, he said, "The church is the only institution that does not exist for itself. The church is the only organization whose primary purpose is for the benefit of people who are not members." And from what we've had, you know, before COVID and now, and looking beyond lockdowns and things, life is really, really difficult. From my own experience, both of growing up in colonial Africa and living in the diaspora, I have seen firsthand the structures in society that are responsible for poverty, and at the same time, the missional opportunities that things like wars and abusive situations and vulnerabilities and diseases like COVID-19, the COVID-19 virus has given to the church. So in responding from experience to the core question, how can the church respond? How can we listen, amplify, and be changed by people experiencing poverty? I would say that we need to go back to the basics of biblical principles, calling out and challenging injustices, reordering our priorities, repurposing our spaces, the spaces in our church buildings, to enlarge our vision for mission. And we've said we are living in a time of so many losses. And what Paul said about, you know, poverty, which is now like people in work experiencing poverty. I was having a conversation with somebody just last Saturday, and he was telling me how he gets universal credit and he pays £800 for his rent, and he doesn't get much money, which is why he had to resort to coming to food bank. So we've also seen a lot of compassion, innovation, and creativity. However, there is still work for us to do. The prophets Micah, Isaiah, Zechariah, Amos, Jeremiah, Malachi, to name a few, spoke passionately about God's vision for justice and have been calling us to this kind of preparing, seeing the simple things that we can work with, the pen and paper to write petitions and call out injustices, food, clothing, hygiene products, which we can make available to people. You just have to look around the community in which you're placed, and it is not difficult to see what is going on. So Jesus is also calling us to this kind of noticing and paying attention, taking an interest in people's lives and in God's creation, showing that we care, and listening to the preparation that God might be offering us in this time as we move into the future. And I believe that we should be inhabiting a theology that overcomes oppression and marginalizations, as one theologian, Michael Jagisser, put it, a theology that takes seriously not only the essential differences which make up identity, things like ethnicity, social status, religion, color, sex, culture, and so on and so forth, but also, to borrow words from liberation theologian Justo Gonzalez, the humankind's existential situation and a response to the here and now. So in my context, in the Enfield Circuit in North London, where I've been stationed since September last year, I have had the privilege of being among one of the most deprived communities in the borough of Enfield. Data taken from the ONS Media Population Estimate 2019 show Ponders End Ward BAME group to be 53.4% of the total population for that area. And Ponders End had the fourth lowest average household income of 21 wards in Enfield, with 33% of households in the ward claiming universal credit. So it is against this background and amid tremendous challenge that we opened the new Ponders End Methodist Church Food Hub last November as a direct response to poverty and food insecurity experienced by people in that community. Hand out food parcels plus hygiene and sanitary products and clothing to an average of 50 people on a weekly basis who come through the church gates every Saturday between 10 and 12 o'clock. And testimonials show that our service is helping a lot of individuals and families improve their health, especially their mental health and well-being in the face of job losses and other traumatic experiences resulting from living in a pandemic. Running this food hub is only a small part of how we can care for our community. It is far more than just handing out food parcels. The hub is giving us a chance to be holistic in our approach to responding and meeting people in their need and to finding ways of enabling them to live life in all its fullness. It is giving us an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. And I have also been reminded about John Wesley's concern for the social issues of his day, the poverty, the slavery, inadequate medical provision, etc. And there's a hymn from Singing the Faith, Lord, your church on earth is seeking renewal. It's kind of years, because I've been asking myself the question, how do we give new hope, new strength and courage beyond pandemic and lockdowns? How do we reach out in the streets where the bruised and lonely dwell? So I think we should be seeking renewal to embody change. The council has been helping us to run this food hub. And again, in conversations with people who are coming there, some people think that, okay, we're doing this, but because of the government's involvement, it's just still this vicious circle that they cannot come out of poverty, because when funding ceases, then the service kind of ceases, and they worry about that. So I'm not sure I can share something with you from my screen. So I've stated here that this project has been an occasion of grace, dealing with broken lives and trying to restore dignity. And we're committed to helping our community in these difficult times. We hand out fresh fruits and vegetables, as well as groceries, personal hygiene, clothing, baby food, and other baby essentials. Additionally, we offer nutritious ready meals to those who are homeless or without access to cooking equipment. And it's just been a wonderful time getting to know people, because it's kind of like giving a wraparound service. Not only do we hand out food, but we engage in conversations, get to know them as real people and their struggles, and everything that Paul had said, you know, in his introductory things, I hear them every single week from people's experiences. Okay, thank you.
Jacqueline, thank you so much for that, and thank you for sharing all that's going on at the church. Can I have one question, just that I think might help us in our thinking. With the people at the church, is that purely church folks who are volunteering? Is it beyond? Is it the community? Who has actually got involved in doing that alongside you? Oh, you're muted, Jacqueline.
Yes, it's very interesting in this particular church. is actually, we've got a lot of youngsters, teenagers, who are volunteering. And because of the pandemic and the hall that we're using is very small, we've had inquiries from the community to come and help, but we haven't accepted that because, you know, of the social distancing and things that we have to put in place. So we've been encouraging these young teenagers who've been coming religiously since November when we've opened, and helping them to understand that this is their church, and church is not only what happens on Sunday, but church also happens, you know, in these places. And, you know, being there, you know, and helping out is a very good way of serving God.
That's great. Thank you so much. And that's great to hear. And thank you so much for sharing your story. And do share our thanks with the young people of the church who were joining in.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. And now, let's just get Janet up. Janet, welcome.
Hello, I've been having a bit of problems with my internet, so I hope I don't drop off. I'm Janet, and I run a day centre for the homeless and vulnerable in Clacton, and in the Tendring area, deprived areas in the southeast. And we have found, because of the pandemic, we've had a rise in people accessing our services. Obviously, we've had to stop indoor service, and we've been doing a takeaway service. We were averaging between about 40 a day, and now we're averaging about 60 a day. So it's risen a lot, and we've tried to respond to that by offering hot food as well as sandwiches and takeaways. Experience the root causes of poverty more than anything else, particularly homelessness, which is a vast problem. But often trauma. One of the things we now have is a crisis cafe, which is run by Mind at the church every evening, which responds to people in crisis. I mean, I can echo the fact that actually the benefits that people have are not enough to live on. Ladies I spoke to when I came back, because I'm just back face to face, which I haven't been for a long time, said, "Oh, it's so lovely to see you. You really don't realise how important what you do is, because there would literally be people starving if you weren't feeding us." And when you hear that, it does shock you, really, but I think it's true. The other thing I would also concur with is that it is hitting the young people hardest. In fact, the housing people that we work with, because we work with all a range of professional organisations that work with the homeless, and they say it is actually impossible to find anyone a home who is under the age of 35, because the housing benefit for those under 35 is so low, it is actually impossible to find them anywhere to live. And the advice we were given was, during the pandemic, well, we'll have to give them sleeping bags and a tent. And that was the answer once. I mean, everybody was taken off the streets initially, which was great. So, yeah, what can we do about it? How can we tell these people stories? And I think one of the great things we can do is to challenge the stereotypes. If people say to us, which they've said to me, "Oh, people are homeless because they don't work, they don't want a job, or they've chosen to be homeless because nobody needs to be homeless in this day and age," are the kind of things that I hear, sometimes from our congregations, and one gently has to put them right. What always impresses me is how much of a community they are, and how much they care for each other, the people who come to our organisation. Today we had a young man who came, I guess he was in his 20s, difficult to tell, but I would have said so, and he was obviously, I would guess, on heroin, but in a pretty bad way. and so he really didn't know what he was doing. And immediately a group gathered round him, they sorted him out some clean clothes, they made sure that he had the food he needed, they even packed it all up and made sure he had some bottled water. They care about one another, they really care about one another, and we can learn so much about the way they treat each other. So yeah, we've got to challenge stereotypes that we hear and speak out.
Janet, thank you so much. I think my question for you is, in challenging stereotypes, you hinted that sometimes you need to do that within the church. How are you finding that, and how are you trying to get that message across to the church? And perhaps just share with us the good things of that and the challenges of that.
Well, because I think it's so important, even though I'm a deacon, I choose to preach every Sunday, and in some way or other I try and bring in my life experiences of what I'm doing into the conversations and my preaching, particularly when it's relevant. But so often it is, because you only have to read the gospel to know how relevant the work we're doing is. And then I have conversations with people afterwards, because I will challenge them, and people sometimes come back and try and challenge me, and that's when I have the opportunity to say what I believe and invite people to come down. I mean, obviously that's not really, you can't really do that at the moment.
Friends, I'm conscious that we're nearly at the end of our time together. I've asked our panelists to kindly share, to have the last word. I thought you wouldn't mind them having the last word. And I invited them, if they were going to encourage people to one action or one response, what would it be? And as they share their responses, I also would like to invite you to think, what is your response to this evening? It doesn't have to be immediate, but as they share their response, their action, what is it that God might be inviting you to in response to all you've heard this evening? So shall we start with Jacqueline? What's your, what thing would you say to encourage people? One action or one response?
I think having a compassionate heart, you know, and being able to be alongside people, you know, either being the voice for them or doing, you know, helping out in any way that people can is useful.
Thank you. A compassionate heart. Janet? Has Janet frozen? Leanne, what would you add?
I think, I mean, there's big things that need to happen, but my personal main thing would be a small thing of friendship, and find something that you and another person whose life's different from you both enjoy doing, and do it together.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. And Paul?
I think for me, it is something around story and something around encounter, but the most important thing is allowing yourself and your church to be changed. It's really easy to invite people into my space to do my thing, and you're perfectly welcome to do my thing. But it's very hard to say, I want to listen to your story and be changed by it. And I think that goes to what Leanne was saying about the use of story. Often we change people's stories in order for ourselves not to be changed. And we use them as case studies to evidence our beliefs. And the best stories are the ones which you go away a different person after you've heard it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to repeat what Janet said, because it's in the chat now. If you see someone who is homeless on the street, please don't ignore them. Please don't make them into a non-person. Thank you so much for that, Janet. Thank you. Friends, thank you. A huge thank you to Paul and to Leanne and to Janet and to Jacqueline for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for sharing what is clearly your passion at the heart of your work. It's really appreciated. And thank you all of you for joining us. If you'd like to watch any of this again, the webinar will be available on the Evangelism and Growth Team website. If you want to contact Paul or myself to talk about some of these issues further, we'd be really keen to hear from you. And just to say thank you so much for taking the time on a Tuesday evening after a long day for yet more Zoom chats. So thank you so much, and God bless you all.